There is a map of the world made out of sand off the coast of Dubai. But after 23 years, most of it is still sand. 300 islands were dredged into place between 2003 and 2008 at a cost of about $14 billion. And today, somewhere between 10 and 15% of them have anything built on them at all. At first, this might just seem like a property project that ran late. It is not. Every one of those 300 shapes has to be held in position by marine work that never stops, and somebody is paying for that work on islands that earn nothing. The archipelago is 9 kilometers long and 6 kilometers wide. It sits about 4 kilometers offshore. From an aircraft window on the approach into Dubai, you can see the whole thing, and you can see how much of it is blank. If you have ever stood on a beach and watched the tide take a sandcastle you built an hour earlier, you already understand the mechanism. Not the drama of it, the patience of it. Water moves sand from where it is to where it wants to be, and it does that whether or not anyone is watching, and whether or not the sand cost $14 billion. That is the state of it today. But to understand why nobody can stop this financial bleeding, you have to look past the empty sand and look at the invisible rules that created it. To understand this, you have to stop looking at the renderings and start looking at the survey boat. Somebody has to go out and measure those shapes. Not once, on a schedule. A crew takes depth readings along the channels between the islands, and those readings decide whether a vessel can still reach a plot that nobody has built on yet. Now go back to 2003, because the ambition was not small and it was not stupid. Dubai had already proven it could make land. The plan announced that year was to dredge 300 islands into the shape of a world map, sell them as private islands, and let the buyers build. Nakheel, the state-linked developer behind it, was not selling apartments, it was selling countries. An island representing a nation, priced in the tens of millions of dollars, with nothing on it but sand and a coastline you owned outright. The engineering was real work. Between 2003 and 2008, crews moved about 321 million cubic meters of sand from the seabed and placed it into shapes accurate enough to read from orbit. Around the whole archipelago, they built a breakwater roughly 26 kilometers long to take the wave energy before it reached the islands. Individual plots ran from about 14,000 to 42,000 square feet. Think about what that means as a job. A vessel sails to a licensed borrow area, cuts sand off the seabed, carries it several kilometers, and sprays it into position, while a positioning system holds the hull within a meter or two of where the drawing says the coastline of Chile should be. Then it does that again, for 5 years. And it worked, for a while. Buyers came. The plots were marketed as the last private islands anyone would ever be able to own within sight of a major city, and for a stretch between 2004 and 2008, that pitch was not absurd. Dubai was delivering. The palm was rising a few kilometers away, and people who had bought early on it were already ahead. A man who bought a country in 2005 was not being reckless by the standards of the room he was standing in. He was buying the thing the whole city was buying, which was the assumption that the next 5 years would look like the last 5. By 2008, the shapes existed. Sales were strong. Plot prices had been rising. Then, in the space of about 3 months, the assumption that everyone in that room was holding stopped being true. If you find this useful, the channel is called PT Team, and it exists to show you the number underneath the announcement, the one that decides what a piece of infrastructure can actually carry, rather than what it was promised to carry. Subscribe now, because the next part is where the sand stops being the hard problem. Then, the credit stopped. The 2008 financial crisis arrived in Dubai with unusual force, because so much of the Emirates' growth had been financed rather than earned. Nakheel was carrying debt reported at around 60 billion dirhams and went through a restructuring. Construction across the city halted. On the world, it halted before it had really begun. In 2009, the Emirate needed support from Abu Dhabi to meet obligations coming due, and the tallest building in the world opened in 2010 under a name it had not been designed to carry. That is the context. The world was not singled out. It was one asset inside a balance sheet that had run ahead of its income, and when the income stopped arriving, The asset that had no tenants was the one nothing could be done with. What halted was not the dredging was finished. What halted was every decision that was supposed to come after it. A plot only becomes a building when an owner commissions a design, hires a contractor, arranges power and water across 4 kilometers of open sea, and finds people willing to work out there. In 2009, nobody was commissioning anything, and the 300 shapes sat in the water in exactly the condition the marine crews had left them. Here is the number that tells the whole story. In 2013, a decade after the announcement, a Gulf News report on the project counted the islands with development on them. The figure was 2 out of 300. Now, 23 years after the announcement, the figure is 10 to 15%. Call it 30 to 45 islands with something on them, which means that somewhere between 270 of those shapes are still exactly what they were when the last dredger left: sand, in the shape of a country, in the sea. This is where the mechanism gets interesting, and it is not the mechanism most people assume. In January 2011, satellite images prompted a wave of reports saying the islands were sinking and merging back into the Gulf. Nikhil called the reports wholly inaccurate. A company spokesperson said the whole project is built on a plateau of rocks and that the islands were not going anywhere. The same spokesperson acknowledged some shifting of sands on the beach areas of some islands. Both of those statements can be true at once, and that is the part worth understanding. An island of this kind is not a solid object. It is a rock core with sand placed against it. The rock stays. The sand is a surface, and surfaces in seawater are negotiable. Wave energy arriving at an angle moves sand along a shoreline. Sand that leaves one place arrives somewhere else, usually in a channel, usually where a boat needs to pass. On a developed island, buildings, roads, seawalls, and planting hold the shape. On an empty one, nothing does. The crew who do this work read the sea the way a road engineer reads a pavement. They are looking for where material has left and where it has arrived. On an island with a hotel on it, the answer is boring, because the shoreline is armored and planted and it stays where it was put. On an island with nothing, the answer changes every season, and the people taking the readings know which shapes are the troublesome ones before they get there. So the islands are not disappearing, they are doing something more expensive than disappearing. They are quietly rearranging themselves, and every rearrangement has to be surveyed, dredged, and put back by someone with a vessel and a day rate. There is one more thing about empty land and seawater that people who have not worked on it tend to miss. Vegetation is structure. Roots bind a surface layer and hold it against wind and against the run-up of waves. A planted island resists in a way a bare one does not, and planting requires irrigation, and irrigation requires a water line, and a water line requires that somebody has decided to build. So the islands that most need holding together are precisely the ones that have nothing holding them together. And that is not a coincidence. It is the same missing decision showing up in a different place. Now the second mechanism, and this one is the cost of the solution rather than the cost of the problem. That 26-kilometer breakwater does exactly what it was built to do. It takes wave energy, but a barrier that stops waves also slows the exchange of water between the inside and the outside. Enclosed or semi-enclosed water bodies in warm climates behave differently from open coast. Temperature rises, salinity rises, circulation drops. Marine engineers design flushing gaps for exactly this reason, and the size and placement of those gaps is a trade-off. More flushing means more wave energy reaching the islands, and less wave energy means less flushing. There is a second-order effect that engineers watch for on any enclosed basin in a hot climate. Warmer, saltier, slower water holds less oxygen. That changes what lives in it, which changes what settles on the bed, which changes how the bed behaves when a dredger comes back to move it. None of that is dramatic on any single day. All of it is a maintenance variable that the original sales brochure did not contain, and the workers who deal with it are the ones who find out first. That is not a design failure. It is a design tension, and it exists on every enclosed reclamation on Earth. What makes it expensive here is that the trade-off has to be managed for 300 islands, of which most produce no income to pay for the managing. Read those three things together, because that is the actual shape of this project. First, the sand needs maintenance. Second, the maintenance has to be paid for. Third, 255 or more of the islands generate nothing to pay it with. Before the criticism, the fair version of the ledger. Dubai did not invent this problem, and it is not alone in it. Enclosed reclamations from Hong Kong to Rotterdam carry maintenance obligations that outlive the people who approved them, and most cities discover the running cost only after the ribbon is cut. What is unusual here is the ratio, an obligation spread across 300 assets against income from roughly a tenth of them. There is one place on the map where the original plan is actually being built, and it deserves credit before criticism. The heart of Europe is a 6-island cluster developed by the Kleindienst Group at a stated cost of around $5 billion. It has 16 hotels planned, hundreds of villas and apartments, and a set of floating villas moored alongside. The Côte d'Azur Monaco Hotel opened at the start of 2023. In 2023, the chairman and founder, Josef Kleindienst, told The National the project was targeting completion in 2026, after delays he attributed in part to the pandemic. That is a real development with real staff, real guests, and a real construction program. Anyone who says nothing has been built on the world has not looked. But hold it next to the original number. 6 islands out of 300. One developer carrying a $5 billion program on 2% of the archipelago, on a completion date that has already moved more than once. Now the part that decides whether this ends. When Nikhil sold those islands, it sold them to many different buyers. Some were developers, some were investors who intended to flip, some were sovereign or corporate entities. Then the crisis came. Some buyers walked, some plots changed hands on the secondary market, and the ownership of the archipelago fragmented. That fragmentation is the reason this cannot be finished by decision. There is no single owner who can order 300 islands built. There is no single owner who can order them removed either. The Dubai Land Department can register a transfer. The Dubai Maritime City Authority can regulate what moves through the water. Neither can make a man who owns a sand island in the shape of Uruguay start building on it. This is the point on the ladder that matters most, and it is worth stating plainly. Every earlier step in this story could in principle be solved by money. Sand can be replaced, channels can be dredged, flushing gaps can be recut, a breakwater can be modified. All of it is engineering, and Dubai has never had trouble buying engineering. The last step cannot be solved by money, because the problem is not a shortage of money. It is that the money would have to be spent by 300 separate decisions that no one person is able to make. An owner who wanted to sell and exit needs a buyer who wants an island with no services on it. An owner who wanted to build needs neighbors who are building at the same time. Neither of those things can be ordered, financed, or engineered. So the maintenance bill continues, the revenue does not arrive, and no institution has the authority or the money to stop the arrangement or complete it. It is worth being exact about who is exposed here, because it is not evenly shared. An owner who bought one island in 2005 and still holds it has a plot, a title deed registered with the Dubai Land Department, and an annual obligation attached to an asset with no income. A developer with a working hotel has revenue to set against the same obligation, and the contractors who do the marine work are paid either way, which is the only comfortable position on the whole archipelago. The people with the least room are the ones who bought a single plot as an investment and have now held it for 2 decades. They cannot build it out alone, because a single island 4 kilometers offshore with no power, no water main, and no road is not a buildable proposition by itself. It needs neighbors, and the neighbors are in the same position. Follow that down to the people who actually work out there. On a normal marine project, the survey and dredging cycle exists to serve construction. Here it exists to serve the possibility of construction. A crew goes out, takes the readings, moves the sand, and comes back, so that a plot which has been empty since 2008 remains a plot that could theoretically be reached by a vessel. That is the strangest job in Dubai, and nobody has ever put it on a brochure. The city sold private islands. What it actually created was a permanent maintenance obligation spread across an area 9 kilometers by 6 kilometers, on assets that mostly do not exist yet. Here is the part worth taking away. The world did not fail as engineering. The shapes were placed accurately enough to read from space. The rock plateau under them has held for 23 years, and the breakwater does what a breakwater does. Nikhil's spokesperson was right in 2011. The islands are not going anywhere. What expired was an assumption about time. The plan assumed the buyers would build quickly, because in 2003, everything in Dubai was being built quickly. On that assumption, the maintenance cost is a short bridge between dredging and occupancy. Remove the assumption, and the bridge has no far end. The sand still needs surveying in 2026. It will still need surveying in 2036. And on more than 250 of those islands, there is still nothing at the other end of the bridge to pay for it. That is the difference between a project that is late and a project that has changed category. A late project has a completion date that keeps moving. This one has a maintenance obligation that does not depend on completion at all. There is a version of this story that would be easy to write and would be wrong. It would say, Dubai was foolish, that the whole thing was vanity, that the sea is taking back what never belonged to anyone. Watch the work instead of the renderings, and that reading falls apart. The engineers placed 321 million cubic meters of sand accurately enough to read from orbit. The rock plateau has held for 23 years. The developer building on 6 of the islands is delivering hotels that people actually stay in. The honest criticism is narrower. A city that was very good at building things assumed that being good at building things was the hard part. It was not. The hard part was the 20 years afterwards, and nobody priced them. If you want to know whether the same assumption is running somewhere near you, look for any asset that was approved on the basis of demand that had not arrived yet, and ask who pays to keep it in position while everyone waits. A stadium, a ring road, a terminal building, a business park on the edge of a city. The mechanism is identical, only the sand is unusual. So the honest answer to whether the world failed is that it depends on which promise you are grading. As a piece of marine construction, it succeeded, and it is still standing. As a property development, it has delivered roughly a tenth of what was announced in 23 years. And as a financial object, it became something nobody described in 2003, an asset whose running costs are certain and whose revenues are optional. The satellite image at the start of this video shows a map of the world in the sea. Most of the countries on it are empty. Somebody is out there this week making sure they stay in the right place. That is the image I would keep. Not a ruin and not a disaster. A crew on a working boat, on an ordinary Tuesday, maintaining the coastline of a country that has never had anybody live on it. One thing before the end. Nothing here is financial, investment, or policy advice. The development figures come from published company and press reporting current to August 2026, and a fuller note on sources is in the description. If you have worked marine survey, dredging, or coastal engineering anywhere in the Gulf, tell me in the comments what maintenance on an unbuilt reclamation actually costs a year, because that is the number I could not find, and I will pin the best answer at the top.